The binding upon your wrists is tightening. Yet it is not the bite of rough rope, but the smooth, calculated constriction of expensive silk, chosen specifically because it leaves no marks on the merchandise. You are kneeling on wet stone, in a chamber that reeks of lamp oil and a fear so palpable it tastes like iron. Before you stand 3 doors, behind the first, the rhythmic weeping of the damned. Behind the second, a silence akin to drowning. And behind the third, the soft, terrifying clink of wine cups. Your name is Catherine. You are 23 years old, and in the ruins of 1260 Damascus. You are about to learn that survival is a fate far more complex than death. But before we turn the handle of that third door to see what lies within, I ask that you signal your presence by pressing subscribe. And tell me in the comments below from which safe city you are witnessing this history tonight. To understand the specific nature of the hell that awaited Catherine, we must first understand the catastrophic mistake that led her to its gates. 6 hours before she found herself kneeling on that cold limestone floor, her father sat in his study in the heart of Acre, making a calculation that he believed was prudent, but which was, in reality, a fatal error of judgment. He was a merchant of significant standing, a man who dealt in spices and silks, and like many men of commerce who operate on the fringes of war, he laboured under the dangerous delusion that gold and paper could arrest the motion of steel. On his desk sat a document, a heavy parchment sealed with red wax and stamped with the intricate calligraphy of a Mamluk official. It was a contract of safe passage, a promise written in both Arabic and Latin, assuring that his household and his goods would be treated with neutrality should the city fall. He looked at that seal, running his thumb over the hardened wax, believing that the civilization of the enemy would outweigh their brutality. He told Catherine, as the distant thrum of siege engines began to shake the dust from the rafters, that they were civilized men who respected the laws of trade. He was wrong. When the Mamluk armies finally breached the gates of Acre in the spring of 1260, those contracts dissolved like ink cast into a raging sea. The soldiers pouring through the streets were not interested in the nuances of mercantile law, nor were they moved by the wax seals of bureaucrats. To them, the document Catherine's father clutched was nothing more than kindling for the fires that would soon consume his home. History often records the fall of cities in terms of numbers. 10,000 dead, 20,000 captured. But the human mind cannot grasp such arithmetic. The reality of that afternoon was not a number. It was a sensory overload of chaos. It was the sound of the front door splintering inward, not with a dramatic crash, but with a sickening crunch of dry wood giving way to iron. It was the smell, not just of smoke, but of panic. A scent that is distinct, acrid, and unforgettable to anyone who has ever breathed it. Catherine saw her father die in his own courtyard, still holding that useless piece of parchment aloft as if it were a shield. The blade that ended him did not hesitate for the seal of the Sultan. In the ensuing madness, Catherine and her mother were torn apart. It happened with the terrifying speed of a riptide. One moment they were clasping hands, their fingers interlaced with a desperation that turned knuckles white. And in the next, a surge of armoured bodies broke the connection. Catherine screamed her mother's name until her voice was reduced to a raw, bloody whisper. But the chaos swallowed the sound instantly. She never saw her mother again. She never learned if she perished in the first hour, or if she lingered in some other corner of the Mamluk machine. All she knew was that the world she had inhabited since birth a world of soft cushions, clear rules, and fatherly protection, had evaporated in the span of a single heartbeat. But to understand why Catherine was not killed immediately, why she was instead dragged from the wreckage and placed into a line of trembling captives, we must step back from the smoke of Acre and look into the eyes of her captors. Who were these men? Who were these Mamluks that had descended upon the Crusader states like a plague of locusts? The answer is one of history's most disturbing ironies, and it is essential to understanding the three doors that awaited Catherine. The Mamluks were not born as conquerors. They were not a dynasty of royal bloodlines and inherited entitlements. Every single commander, every emir, every general riding through the burning streets of Acre had started his life exactly as Catherine was ending hers, as a slave. The word Mamluk itself translates literally to property or one who is owned. For generations, the Islamic caliphates had purchased young boys from the Turkic tribes of Central Asia and the Circassian mountains of the Caucasus. These boys were severed from their families, stripped of their identities, converted to Islam, and then subjected to a training regimen of such brutality and precision that it forged them into the finest warriors of the medieval world. They were property, yes, but they were weaponized property. And here lies the psychological key to the horror that was about to unfold. Because these men had been broken and remade by a system of absolute control. They didn't view slavery as a tragedy. They viewed it as a methodology. They viewed it as a technology of transformation. They looked at a captured population not with the chaotic sadism of a barbarian horde, but with the cold, appraising eye of an engineer looking at raw materials. When the Ayyubid dynasty collapsed in 1250, these slave soldiers did the unthinkable. They seized the throne. A paradox was born. A society where the ruling elite was composed entirely of former slaves. This created a unique and terrifying worldview. If a boy from the steppes could be processed, broken, and rebuilt into a sultan, then surely a girl from Acre could be processed, broken, and rebuilt into whatever tool the state required. And the state required much. It required artisans, administrators, laborers, and women who could serve functions that free women would never accept. Thus, the chaos of the conquest was quickly replaced by the order of the inventory. This was not merely war, it was acquisition. The Mamluks approached the processing of human beings with the same rigorous systematic thinking they applied to military logistics. They built infrastructure to handle the influx, holding centers, medical evaluations, classification protocols. Catherine was not just a prisoner of war. She was an unrefined resource entering a complex industrial machine. A machine designed to strip away the person she was and manufacture the person they needed her to be. 3 months after the fall of Acre, having survived the march to Damascus, she stood in that underground chamber, waiting for the assessment that would determine her category. She was about to meet Emir Tashimur, a man whose title, when translated from the administrative Arabic of the time, meant something disturbingly close to integration specialist. Emir Tashimur entered the chamber not with the swagger of a conqueror, but with the quiet, shuffling gait of a scholar. He carried no scimitar at his hip, only a roll of parchment and a stylus of polished ebony. He wore the simple, unadorned robe of a royal steward. Yet the way the armored guards stiffened at his approach, the way they averted their eyes and pressed themselves against the damp limestone walls, revealed the true weight of his authority. In the Mamluk hierarchy, the man who spills blood is merely a tool. The man who decides whose blood is spilled is the architect. He stood before the line of 18 women, his eyes moving across them, not with lust, nor with hatred, but with the dispassionate efficiency of a merchant evaluating the tensile strength of wool. He was looking for cracks in the porcelain. He was looking for utility. Behind him stood the 3 doors, heavy oak reinforced with iron bands. To Catherine, standing shivering in a dress that was once fine silk, but was now stained with the mud of the march. These doors were the only reality left. The first door opened. Through it, a burst of harsh sunlight and the smell of unwashed bodies and livestock. This was the door for the physical. Women with strong backs and calloused hands. Women whose value lay in their muscle. They would be sent to the kitchens of the military barracks, or distributed to the lower ranks of the soldiery as domestic servants. Their lives would be hard, brutal, and short, but they would retain their names. They would be allowed to weep. The second door remained closed, but from behind it came the muffled roar of the city. This was the door to the public slave markets of Damascus. Those selected for this path were the surplus inventory, women who fit no specific category of high value, who would be sold to the highest bidder by the afternoon prayer. Their fate was a roll of the dice, a chaotic gamble that could lead to a kind master or a tyrant. But it was the third door that drew Tashimore's attention. It was smaller than the others. It did not lead to the outside world. It led deeper into the complex. He moved down the line, stopping occasionally to ask a question in broken Greek, or Armenian, or the Frankish tongue. He was filtering when he stopped in front of a young girl, barely 16, with terror-widened eyes. He spoke a few words. She shook her head, sobbing, unable to comprehend. He made a small notation on his parchment, and with a flick of his finger, condemned her to the first door. She was led away, weeping into the sunlight. Then, he stopped before Catherine. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating. He did not look at her body. He looked at her hands, soft, unblemished by manual labor. He looked at her eyes, searching for the spark of comprehension. "Can you read?" he asked. The question was spoken in Frankish French, and his accent was flawless. A chilling reminder that the enemy had studied them far more closely than they had studied the enemy. In that fraction of a second, Catherine faced a choice that would define the rest of her existence. Her father had raised her to believe that education was a shield, that intellect was a virtue that commanded respect. Instinct screamed at her to prove her worth, to demonstrate that she was not cattle to be herded into a kitchen, that she was sophisticated, valuable, human. She thought that by revealing her mind, she might save her body. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. Latin, French, and the trade dialect of Arabic. Tashimore's expression did not change. There was no smile of approval, no nod of respect. There was only a microscopic shift in his posture, the satisfaction of a puzzle piece clicking into place. He snapped his fingers, and a guard stepped forward with a wooden tablet covered in a layer of smooth wax. Etched into the surface was a line of classical Arabic poetry. Complex, metaphorical, difficult even for native speakers. "Read," he commanded. Catherine squinted in the dim light. She recognized the script. She read the words aloud, stumbling slightly over the pronunciation, but grasping the meaning. It was a verse about the malleability of the soul, about how water takes the shape of the vessel that holds it. Tashimore took the tablet back. He did not say good. He did not say well done. He simply marked a symbol next to her name on his inventory list. It was a symbol she would not understand until it was too late. By proving her intellect, she had disqualified herself from the anonymity of the first door and the chaotic chance of the second. She had selected herself for the third door. The guards took her by the arms, not roughly, but firmly, and guided her away from the sunlight, away from the noise of the market, and into the corridor that led deeper into the earth. As the heavy oak door closed behind her, the sound of the latch clicking into place felt final, like the lid of a coffin being nailed shut. The air here was different. It smelled of incense, dried rose petals, and something else, something sterile and cold. Catherine had been selected for administrative household placement in the official records of the Mamluk state. This was considered a privilege. It was reserved for the elite captives, the educated, the beautiful, the ones capable of complex tasks. But the Mamluks understood something that modern psychology would not articulate for another 7 centuries. The body is easy to enslave. Chains can do that. But the mind, to enslave a mind requires a far more delicate and far more sinister process. She was taken to a room lined with thick carpets that absorbed all sound. 5 other women were there, sitting in a circle, their faces pale, their eyes vacant. They looked up as Catherine entered, but they did not speak. They moved with a strange, fluid grace, as if they were underwater. An older woman entered the room. She wore the high-collared dress of a Mamluk matron, her hair covered in a severe wrap. Her face was a mask of absolute composure. "My name is Sophia," she said, her voice devoid of any recognizable accent, a flat, neutral tone that gave away nothing of her origin. "For the next 60 days, I will be your guide. You have arrived here as Catherine of Acre. That person no longer exists. She died when the door closed. What remains is raw material." Sophia walked around the circle, her steps silent on the heavy rugs. "You have been chosen because you are intelligent," she continued. And for the first time, the horror of the situation began to dawn on Catherine. Intelligence is useful. Intelligence allows for the management of household accounts. It allows for the writing of correspondence. It allows for the entertainment of guests with poetry and wit. She paused, looking directly at Catherine. But intelligence is also a burden, because it allows you to remember what you have lost. My task is to help you forget. We do not use whips here. We do not use starvation. Those are crude tools for crude animals. We use curriculum. And so began the reconstruction. It was not a torture chamber in the traditional sense. There were no racks, no branding irons. It was a school designed to dismantle a human personality and rebuild it from the ground up. The first week was the week of language. "You will not speak your mother tongue," Sophia instructed, not to me, not to each other, not even in your prayers. "If you are caught whispering in Frankish, you will not be beaten. You will simply sit in silence for 24 hours. Total, absolute silence." It sounds manageable, perhaps even mild, but have you ever tried to silence the voice in your own head? Catherine found that when she could not speak her language, she began to lose the ability to think in it. The concepts that defined her, freedom, honor, home, were Frankish words. Without the words, the concepts began to blur, like watercolor paintings left out in the rain. By the second week, the curriculum shifted from the tongue to the spine. Sophia called it body memory. "You see, we carry our history in our posture." A free woman of Acre walked with her chin level with the horizon, her shoulders squared, her gaze direct. It was an unconscious assertion of existence. But in the Mamluk court, such posture was not merely incorrect. It was dangerous. It signaled defiance. And defiance, as Sophia reminded them with her terrifying calm, was a waste of energy. "You are too loud," she would say. Though Catherine had not uttered a sound. "Your presence is shouting. You must learn to be a whisper." For 12 hours a day, they practiced the choreography of submission. How to enter a room without disturbing the air currents. How to pour tea so that the stream of liquid made no sound against the porcelain. How to lower the eyes, not in fear, which is an emotion, but in deference, which is a function. They practiced kneeling until their knees bled. And then they practiced kneeling until the pain was no longer a sensation to be acknowledged, but a background noise to be ignored. Catherine began to realize the genius of the system. They were not trying to break her will through pain. Pain is temporary and breeds resentment. They were rewriting her muscle memory. They were making servitude feel natural. By the end of the 3rd week, when Sophia entered the room, Catherine's body lowered itself into a bow before her mind had even registered the woman's presence. Her body was betraying her. It was learning to survive on its own, independent of her pride. But the fourth week brought the lesson that no amount of kneeling could prepare her for. This was the week of household management. In the administrative records, this term is deceptively benign. It suggests the organizing of linens, the tallying of pantry stocks, and indeed, Catherine was trained in these things. Her literacy made her exceptional at them. She learned the Mamluk system of double-entry bookkeeping. She learned the complex hierarchy of titles used in diplomatic correspondence. She was being forged into a perfect secretary. But household management had a second, darker definition. Sophia sat them down one evening, the lamp oil casting long, dancing shadows against the tapestries. Her voice didn't waver. She spoke with the clinical detachment of a physician explaining a surgical procedure. "You've been categorized as administrative household," she said. "This is a dual designation. By day, you are the mind of the household. You will write, calculate, and organize. You will be respected for your intellect." She paused, letting the silence settle like dust. "But by night, you belong to the body of the household. You will be accessible, you will be compliant, and you will be silent." She did not use the words rape or violation. Those are words of violence. And the Mamluks did not see this as violence. They saw it as usage. A pen is used to write. A woman is used to bear sons. It was purely functional. Sophia then taught them the most important skill of all. It was not a physical technique, but a psychological one. She called it the separation. Today, psychiatrists call it dissociation. When the door closes at night, Sophia instructed, her eyes fixing on Catherine's, "You must not be there. You must leave the room. You cannot leave with your feet. So you must leave with your mind. Float to the ceiling. Count the threads in the tapestry. Conjugate Arabic verbs in your head. Compose poetry. Be anywhere but in your skin. If you stay in your body," she warned, "you will shatter, and shattered things are discarded." Catherine listened, and she understood. This was the final key to the third door. To survive, she had to split herself in two. There would be Catherine the administrator, who wrote beautiful calligraphy and balanced ledgers, and there would be the vessel, a hollow shell that remained in the bedchamber when the sun went down. By the 60th day, the transformation was complete. Catherine stood before the bronze mirror in the training hall. The woman staring back at her was a stranger. She wore Mamluk silks, tied in the fashion of the court. Her hair was scented with jasmine and oud. Her posture was fluid, submissive, yet graceful. She looked like a woman born to this life. The Catherine who had run through the streets of Acre, screaming her mother's name, was gone. Buried under layers of training and trauma, she was ready for placement. The transfer happened at dawn. There was no ceremony, just a transaction, a ledger entry, one female captive, educated, administrative class, transferred to the household of Amir Kalawun. Price, 600 silver dirhams. 600 dirhams. That was the value of her life. It was a substantial sum. The price of a fine warhorse or a small house. It was a compliment. In the twisted language of the market, Amir Kalawun's estate was a fortress of luxury in the heart of Damascus. It occupied an entire city block. A maze of courtyards, fountains, and high walls designed to keep the world out. And the occupants in Kalawun was a rising star in the Mamluk hierarchy. A man of immense ambition who would one day become sultan. But in 1260, he was a general building his power base, and a powerful man needed a powerful household. Catherine was not thrown into a dungeon. She was given a room, small, yes, but clean. It had a window that looked out onto a garden where peacocks roamed. She was given ink, paper, and a desk. Her days settled into a rhythm that was terrifyingly normal. She worked in the correspondence office, a quiet wing of the harem. She wrote letters for Kalawun's senior wife, a formidable woman named Zara, who ran the household with the precision of a military commander. Catherine wrote invitations to banquets, orders for silk merchants, inquiries about political alliances. Her Arabic script became famous within the walls. She was useful. She was valued. Safety. Catherine learned, was boring, and she embraced the boredom. She wrapped herself in the mundane tasks of the day like a shield. As long as she was writing, as long as she was calculating the cost of grain or the inventory of linens, she was safe. She was the administrator, but the sun always sets, and when the shadows lengthened across the courtyard, the dread would begin to coil in her stomach like a cold serpent, because she knew that the administrator would soon have to step aside for the vessel. Kalawun had a son, a young man of 18 who was being groomed for leadership. Part of his education, his curriculum, was the management of the household's resources. Catherine was assigned to him, not as a wife, not as a lover, but as a resource, twice a week, on a schedule as rigid as the prayer calls. She was summoned to his quarters, and twice a week. She practiced the lessons Sophia had taught her. As the door latched shut, Catherine would close her eyes and float to the ceiling. She would stare down at the scene below, watching the young man and the woman on the bed as if they were actors in a play she had no stake in. She would conjugate verbs. Fa'ala, yaf'ulu, fa'lan. She counted the geometric patterns on the ceiling tiles, 88 stars, 44 hexagons. She survived, week by week, month by month. The years began to bleed together. 1261, 1265, 1270. Catherine of Acre was dead. The woman who remained was a ghost haunting her own life. She became a fixture of the household, trusted, silent, efficient. But memory is a stubborn thing. You can pave over it. You can build a fortress on top of it. But the roots remain beneath the soil, waiting for a crack in the stone. And the crack appeared in the 12th year. It didn't come from a grand event. It came from a mirror image. In 1272, a new shipment of captives arrived from a raid in the north. Among them was a girl, Armenian, noble birth, terrified. She was 16 years old. The same age Catherine had been when the training began. The head of the harem, Zara, called Catherine into her chambers. "You have served us well," Zara said, her voice not unkind. "You are disciplined. You understand the protocol. I am assigning this new girl to your care. You will teach her. You will teach her the language. You will teach her the posture." Zara paused, and then added the final blow. "You will prepare her for her duties. You will be her Sophia." Catherine looked at the Armenian girl, and for the first time in 12 years, the dissociation failed. The wall she had built between her mind and her reality cracked. She did not see a stranger. She saw herself. She saw the same trembling hands, the same wide eyes trying to process a nightmare that had no logic. And she realized with a sickening clarity what Zara was asking her to do. It was not enough for the system to consume Catherine. It now required her to become its teeth. To train this girl would be to validate everything that had been done to her. It would be the final surrender. The moment she crossed the invisible line from victim to accomplice, she looked at the girl, whose name was Anoush, and she made a choice. It was a quiet choice, made in the silence of her own heart. But it was louder than any scream she had ever suppressed. No, you do not throw yourself into the gears. You will only be crushed. You must find the loose screw. You must find the flaw in the design. Catherine went back to her room, but she did not sleep. She lit a fresh candle and pulled down the heavy ledgers she had maintained for over a decade. But this time, she was not looking for accounting errors. She was looking for a weapon. The Mamluks were warriors. Yes. But they were also obsessed with legality. They were pious Muslims who believed that their power was ordained by God, and therefore must be exercised within the framework of divine law. They followed Sharia, and within the vast, complex architecture of Islamic jurisprudence. There were rules regarding slavery. It was a system of contradictions. It allowed for the ownership of human beings. Yet it praised the manumission, the freeing of slaves as an act of supreme piety. It stated that a slave who had served faithfully for many years, who had become integral to the household, could petition for freedom. It was rare. It was difficult. But it was legal. Catherine spent 3 weeks preparing. She did not prepare a physical escape. The walls of Damascus were too high, and she had nowhere to go. She prepared a legal argument. She combed through the archives of the household, documenting every letter she had written, every negotiation she had assisted with, every dinar she had saved the estate through her meticulous bookkeeping. She built a dossier of her own value. She was gambling everything on a single, terrifying theory that Sultan Qalawun, the man who had once owned her, who was now the ruler of Egypt and Syria, cared more about his reputation as a just king than he did about a single female scribe. The opportunity arrived on the 3rd day of October, 1284. It was the day of the Mazalim, the public audience of grievances. This was a tradition where the Sultan would sit in the Great Hall of Justice, open to the petitions of his subjects. Usually, it was a theatre for tax disputes, land claims, or merchants seeking compensation for stolen goods. It was not a place for women of the harem, and it was certainly not a place for slaves to speak against their masters. Catherine entered the hall under the pretense of recording the proceedings for the household archives. She sat in the corner, a shadow among shadows, her quill scratching quietly against the parchment. She waited. She watched the endless parade of petitioners, the boredom on the faces of the guards, the rhythmic nodding of the Sultan on his raised dais. Qalawun was an old man now. The warrior who had stormed Acre was gone. In his place sat a monarch draped in gold and heavy velvet, his beard white, his eyes tired but sharp. He was performing the role of the benevolent ruler when a lull fell over the proceedings. A silence between two merchants arguing over the price of indigo. Catherine stood up. The movement was small, but in the rigid protocol of the court, it was like a thunderclap. The scratching of quills stopped. The guards shifted their grip on their halberds. The vizier, standing at the Sultan's right hand, frowned in confusion. A woman from the harem staff, Standing without permission? It was unthinkable. Catherine walked to the center of the room. Her legs were trembling. But her back, the back Sophia had trained to be straight, was rigid. She did not prostrate herself. She bowed. Deeply. Respectfully. But she remained standing. "My Lord Sultan," she said. Her voice was not the whisper of the harem. It was the clear, projected voice of the administrator. She spoke in High Arabic, the formal, poetic dialect of the court, with an accent so pure it shamed half the men in the room. "I am Catherine, scribe of the inner household, servant of your estate for 12 years, 7 months and 4 days. The Sultan looked at her. For a moment, there was no recognition. To him, she had been a resource, a function, not a face. But then, something flickered in his eyes. Perhaps he remembered the young woman from the third door. Perhaps he simply recognized the audacity of the moment. "You have no standing to speak here." The vizier barked, stepping forward. "Guard, remove this. I speak." Catherine interrupted, her voice cutting through the vizier's command like a razor. Under the provision of mukataba and the principle of faithful service recorded in the hadith, she had cited the law. She had turned the holy text into a shield. The vizier froze. To silence her now, after she had invoked the law, would make the Sultan look like a tyrant who disregarded justice. Catherine did not wait. She held up the scroll she had prepared. "I petition for my own manumission," she declared. "I do not ask for charity. I ask for the settlement of a debt. For 12 years, I have managed the correspondence of this house. I have trained your staff. I have educated your sons in language and letters. I have given my labor, my mind, and my body to the service of this estate." She paused, taking a breath that felt like inhaling broken glass. "I have served without resistance. I have served without complaint. I have fulfilled the contract of my enslavement. Now, I ask you to fulfill the contract of your sovereignty. Justice, my lord, not mercy. Justice." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating thing. Every person in the hall held their breath. This was a woman, a slave, a Christian, lecturing the Sultan of the Mamluks on the nature of justice. By all rights, she should have been beheaded on the spot for her insolence. Qalawun stared at her. His face was a mask of stone. He looked at the vizier, then at the chief Qadi sitting to his left. "Is her citation correct?" the Sultan asked quietly. The Qadi, a man who had spent his life studying the law, looked uncomfortable. He stroked his beard, looking from the woman to the Sultan. "The precedent exists, my lord," the Qadi murmured. "Faithful service, absent of rebellion, is grounds for manumission. If the master is benevolent, the trap was sprung. If Qalawun refused her, he admitted he was not benevolent. He admitted that his public display of justice was a sham. He admitted that the law of God meant less to him than the property value of one aging woman. He looked at Catherine, really looked at her. For the first time, he did not see an inventory item. He saw an adversary, and in the strange, twisted code of the Mamluks, he respected an adversary who fought well. A slow, terrifying smile spread across the Sultan's face. "You have a sharp tongue, scribe," he said, "and a sharper memory." He leaned back, waving his hand dismissively. "Let it be written. The petition is granted. You are free." The scribe dipped his quill and wrote the final entry. "Manumitted by decree of Sultan Qalawun. Status: free." The wax was poured. The seal was pressed. And just like that, with the quiet hiss of cooling wax, Catherine of Acre ceased to be property. She walked out of the Hall of Justice not in chains, but as a legal entity. She was free, but freedom. As Catherine stood alone in the blinding sunlight of the Damascus courtyard, was a terrified, hollow thing. Where does a ghost go when it is released from its haunting? She could not return to Acre. The city of her birth was rubble, its stones repurposed for Mamluk fortifications. Her family was dead. Her name had been forgotten in the West. She was a Christian woman in a Muslim empire, 40 years old, unmarried, with no clan to protect her. So, she did the only thing she could do. She went back to her desk. She negotiated a salary, 12 dirhams a month, and continued to write the Sultan's letters. She slept in a room 3 doors down from her old cell. She walked the same corridors. She breathed the same air. The only difference was that she now paid for her own bread, and she possessed the key to her own door. It was a microscopic victory, a victory of technicality. And what of the girl? What of Anoush? The Armenian teenager Catherine had refused to break. History is not a fairy tale. There was no rescue. When Catherine refused the assignment, the system simply rerouted. Anoush was transferred to a different household, to a different instructor, perhaps one less gentle than Catherine might have been. The machine did not stop. It merely replaced the broken cog. Catherine lived the rest of her life knowing that somewhere in the city, Anoush was being broken. And Catherine had bought her own moral purity at the price of abandoning the girl to a stranger. That is the true burden of the survivor, the guilt of being the one who walked away. Catherine died in Damascus in 1315. She was 63 years old. She left no children. She left no great legacy. Her life was a whisper in the roar of an empire. Her name survived only by accident, a single household ledger, misplaced in an archive, untouched by moths or fire for 700 years, until a researcher blew the dust off its cover in 1953. There, in a column of numbers and inventory lists, was the notation of her manumission, a single line of ink that proved she had existed, that she had fought, that she had won, however small the victory. So, why tell this story? Why drag Catherine's ghost from the darkness of that archive? Because we like to believe that monsters look like monsters. We want evil to be a barbarian with a sword, screaming for blood. It makes us feel safe. It makes us feel civilized. But the Mamluks were not barbarians. They were civilized. They were poets. They were architects. They were men of law. And yet, they built a system that processed human souls with the same dispassionate efficiency that a miller processes grain. They didn't commit these atrocities in a fit of madness. They did it with paperwork. They did it with integration strategies and household management and educational curriculum. They convinced themselves that the third door was not a dungeon, but a school. And as I look at the world today, at our own systems of bureaucracy, our own sterilized terms for human suffering, our own capacity to turn people into numbers on a spreadsheet, I wonder if Amir Tashimor were standing here today, holding his ebony stylus and wearing a modern suit, would we even recognize him as a monster, or would we simply call him an efficient administrator? The doors of 1260 have rotted away. The Mamluks are dust. But the logic of the system, the belief that a human being can be reshaped, repurposed, and used if you just apply enough pressure, that logic never died. It is still waiting, perhaps behind a door much closer than you think. Sleep well.